There we are. We are now live. So thank you very much for everybody coming. So this is our first deep dive this year, just really going beyond the language and immersing yourself in the culture and what it means to be D-deaf. So our first one of these is focusing on what it means to live both as a deaf person and also as a gay person. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Calum, who's our presenter for this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and talk about my experience. My presentation is going to be talking about my experience as a deaf person and as a gay person. And just to let you know, this is my sign name, just so that you know. So I grew up, my personal experience is going to be different to other people's experience. There are certain differences between younger gay people and older gay people. So everybody's going to have their own unique experience. And by no means, I'm not saying that my experience is the same as anyone else's. So who am I? Well, you can see the 4 pictures at the top of the slide there. I'm deaf, so that symbol kind of represents deafness. I'm a British Sign Language user. I'm profoundly deaf. Secondly, I'm gay. Been gay all my life. Thirdly, I go to University College London, UCL. Obviously, I know people attending this this webinar are also from UCL, so you know that I go to UCL. And then fourthly, I study maths. So I'm a bit of a maths geek. I love maths formulas and all that kind of thing. And just a brief history about me. I was born in Nottingham and I lived there for a few years before I moved to Peterborough. So I grew up in Peterborough and I spent a lot of my life in Peterborough. Now I live in London, obviously because I'm studying here at UCL. So I've been in London throughout my university career. And you can see there's a cute little baby photo of me there. And I'll talk to you about my experiences of going to different universities as well. I've delivered this presentation at different universities. Do you think this photo is me, or do you think it's my brother? And I remember my mum saying, I can't actually remember. I don't know if it's you or your brother. I can't remember, but it's one of us anyway. And I put the picture here, whether it's me or my brother, it's one of us anyway. Put the pictures there. Growing up, yeah, you know, I was kind of a normal child. I had parents, brother, so you can see some family photos of us here on this slide. Growing up, yeah, just kind of did normal child things. You can see that I was quite keen when I was younger. I used to love playing with girl toys, and I used to love Barbie. You can see my Barbie dolls here. And I also used to love playing computer games as well. Okay, so I don't want to, you know, say too much about kind of my life, and I want to focus more on the topic of this presentation, which is relating to the identity of being deaf and gay. But kind of growing up myself, going to school and being with peers and looking at films and media and television and all of that kind of thing, you know, often there are stories where there's a man who meets a woman and they fall in love and then things happen and they live happily ever after. And so growing up, when I, you know, was exposed to all this media, I always thought, oh, well, that's how life should be. You know, one day I will grow up and get married to a woman. And, you know, maybe I used to think, oh, you know, I'd get married because then I'd be able to kind of play with my wife's hair and be able to help each other with with each other's hair and things. And it seems a bit funny now looking back, but growing up, that's really what I used to think of marriage. So yeah, when I was younger, thinking about the future, this is kind of the image that I always had in my head. So I went to primary school, and then after primary school, I went to a deaf secondary school. And for me, that was the first time I was able to kind of get immersed in the deaf community, which was great. Everybody used sign language at their school. There was a lot of diversity there. So that was a really rich and valuable experience for me. And while I was at school, at secondary school, I'll just talk a little bit about what actually happened at secondary school and kind of my experience of secondary school. I didn't know what the word gay meant when I was in school. I'd never really thought about what this word meant. But then internally, I knew that I was attracted to other boys, but I just thought it was normal to have this attraction. Um, I just thought that these feelings and these emotions that I was having were just normal, basically. But then boys would kind of play around with the words and say like, I'm gay for you, or I'm gay for him, or use the word gay in particular ways. And I always thought that, yeah, that kind of it's, I thought that relationships could only be from people of the opposite sex. I always thought a romantic relationship had to be a woman and a man. I never thought that a relationship could be same sex. So a lot of people would say, oh, I'm gay with this person, or I'm gay with them, or I'm gay for them, or something, which didn't really mean the same thing. But also at school, sex education covered things like straight sex. It covered, other topics around sex, but it never really broached the topic of LGBT relationships. So, thinking back at school and the sex education that I had was completely absent of LGBT education, of same-sex relationships, just didn't exist. And I remember one time I was at school and I saw a friend of mine, and they were talking to one of the staff members, and they were having a discussion, and he asked a question about gay relationships or something, and the staff member said, "Oh, yeah, gay men have a hard life." And that kind of really stuck with me, and I thought, oh my god, like, if I'm come out as gay, then I'm going to have a really difficult life. Therefore, I don't want to be gay. I don't want to come out as gay because I don't want to have that difficult life. But there are also negative connotations attached to it as well, underlying connotations, because I didn't really understand what this word meant, but I knew that it was used in a negative way. I knew that it was used to kind of mock people, and it was used in a derogatory way. And that also stuck with me, and there was a lot of shame associated to that word. So I didn't want to kind of say, actually, I fancy boys, because I was fearful of that reaction because of the negativity and because of the hostility that existed there. So of course I knew inside that I was attracted to men, but I was kept telling myself, no, I'm not gay. So unfortunately, I had to then move to a different school because the deaf school that I was at couldn't offer me the GCSE options that I wanted to do. So I moved again. That was a big life change for me, moving schools again. And I moved to, I'm just thinking about order of my slides, sorry. Yeah, so I moved to a mainstream school, and there was some people who were gay, but then I myself, I was a bit like, I'm not so sure. And I thought perhaps I'm bisexual because, yeah, I do have attraction to men. But then at the time, I kind of experimented with a relationship with a girl. And I just thought to myself, well, if I'm gay, well, no, I can't be gay because I'm in a relationship with a woman, with a girl. So therefore, I can't be gay. So I must be bisexual. So I kind of went with that relationship for a while, and just figured out that actually something wasn't right here. So I decided to finish that relationship, and I felt fine actually, because it meant that, you know, I knew that I didn't have any romantic feelings for women, and I thought, okay, fine. And then kind of later on, I just kind of got to the point where I admitted to myself that actually, yeah, I am gay. And the first time I came out was to my mum, and we had a chat, and I also had another discussion with another female friend of mine as well. And we went out on a date, and it seemed fine, seemed okay. And then a few days before Valentine's Day, the Valentine's Day came along, and I remember waking up in the morning just feeling kind of not right. Something inside me just didn't feel right, and I just felt, no, I should have a boyfriend, not a girlfriend. And then that's when I kind of woke up. It was that moment that I realized, actually, no. So I went down into the kitchen. I met my mum. My mum was in the kitchen, and I spoke to her, and I said, you know, I'm not sure about, like, yeah, because, you know, I went on a Valentine's date with a girl, and my mum said, you know, are you not sure about kissing? Oh, don't worry, you know, your age, it's normal to, you know, be like, ooh, kissing, don't like it. But I was like, no, that's not the issue here. And it was really difficult to really get it out, to really say it. And I was getting really emotional and crying. And mum was saying, no, no, it's fine, calm down. So, you know, in the end, I told my mum that I fancy boys, that I like boys. And mum said, okay, fine. You know, she was really good about it. She accepted it. She said, it doesn't matter. You know, I still love you, as, you know, you're my son. And yeah, that was that. But, you know, I was still very confused because I wasn't really sure if I was bisexual or gay or what. I don't know. And I worried about my future as well, about having children, because, you know, gay men can't have children, um, you know, biologically. So then I thought, yeah. And then later I went out on another date with that girl, and that was okay. And, you know, she understood that actually, you know, we weren't working together as a couple, and she was absolutely fine about that. And I just kind of felt really relieved afterwards. So yeah. And then when I finished school, I kind of was like looking for people who were in a similar boat to me, who identified as being gay like me, and I couldn't find them. But I knew that I'd come out, and I thought that actually, if I do come out, then maybe some other people will come out, and actually we'll get to meet and share those experiences. So it was baby steps really from coming out. And when I told my friends eventually, they were fine. Actually, they accepted me. They were quite positive about it. And so for me, that made me really happy. And yeah, I mean, from my experience, I didn't really suffer any bullying or harassment. I know some people definitely have. I wish that I had other gay people at school with me so that I could have shared those experiences. But, you know, there is such a lack of youth groups for LGBT, especially in my area where I was living in Peterborough. There was no kind of like youth groups for young people, for young LGBT people, but especially there was nothing for deaf people. And I had a look at some deaf LGBT groups, and a lot of them were kind of more populated by older people. I was still under 18 at the time. I was still very young, and I thought that's not really an appropriate age group for me. I don't really feel comfortable getting involved in that particular age group. And also going to a mainstream school, that was really difficult for me to kind of find other deaf gay people and to meet other deaf gay people, because I was outside of the deaf community. So, you know, I knew that at the school there were some other people there who did identify as gay, but yeah. So then when I finished mainstream school, I went to a deaf sixth form. So I went back to a deaf school, which was great. So I went deaf school, mainstream deaf school. And when I was there, I kind of found a group of friends that were really similar to me, who had those LGBT experiences. That was a massive relief for me, because I was like, finally, I've got a group of friends. We're all the same. You know, we've all had to been through the same thing. We have the same experience. We're all both deaf. We're all deaf, and we all identify as LGBT. So that was great. And I was also involved in definitely youth theatre. And definitely youth theatre do a number of different theatrical events, but being involved in that was really good because I was able to learn about acting skills and theatre. So I met a lot of other people through that as well, so that was a really nice experience. So now, then I went to university after sixth form, and I moved to London to go to university. That was a massive life change for me because there's a huge deaf community in London and so much diversity within the deaf community, so many events. And yet, even moving to London, I was still looking for where are all the young deaf LGBT people? They still couldn't find them. And I've capitalized here, young, gay, and deaf, because I think all those three identities are really important. I've been searching for people who identify as all three for a long, long time, and I just can't find them. It seems to be very rare. I know there have been some events, kind of smaller events, where they are trying to encourage more young, deaf LGBT people to come, but unfortunately, only few people have been coming to those events. And I've always been curious as to why. I wonder whether it's because young deaf people, LGBT people, aren't interested in going to those events. But also, I think maybe these people prefer to just hang around in their own school groups, their own school friends groups, and they don't want to interact with other people or meet new people. I don't know. Um, but I think kind of the deaf mainstream community, I think it's more difficult for deaf people, for deaf LGBT people, than it is for for the general deaf mainstream community. And I know back in the day it used to be really, really difficult for deaf LGBT people, extremely difficult. And I think perhaps because back in the day, um, LGBT people just weren't accepted in the community. The deaf community didn't accept LGBT people. Mainstream society didn't accept LGBT people at that time. So actually, it became two identities because they were deaf, so they were involved in the deaf community, um, and they were sent to oral schools and they weren't accepted. Sign language wasn't accepted. Sign language was banned. Being gay was not acceptable. Being LGBT and all these other identities wasn't acceptable. So even when they went to deaf clubs and even when they interacted within the deaf community, their sexuality still was not accepted. So it wasn't accepted anywhere. Um, and they had to meet in maybe specific LGBT spaces. But there weren't many deaf LGBT spaces. So actually, what they had to do is put up with going to hearing LGBT spaces, which is very different because there's a lot of barriers there, a lot of communication barriers, cultural barriers, etc., etc. So as a deaf person, so as a deaf LGBT person, finding these double barriers basically, because there's a barrier in the deaf community and there's a barrier in the hearing community as well. So I think over time things have evolved, things have changed, things have got better. And I think today, I think today the deaf community are much more open-minded. They're very accepting of LGBT people. And I think that's because the deaf community is just so small. I think as a deaf community, it's counterproductive to be turning people away from the community and shrinking it even further. And I think the difference is kind of deaf community, LGBT deaf people are in the deaf community and they're kind of assimilated into it and mainstream. But then at the same time, I do feel like there is some kind of segregation within the deaf community as well. I think that does definitely exist. And I think, this is pre-coronavirus, pre-pandemic, but every 3 months there used to be a specific deaf LGBT meetup. It was called Brothers and Sisters. And we'd meet in North London and usually The people who kind of went there were older deaf people, older deaf LGBT people. And I thought, okay, that's fine, that's good enough. I mean, I personally feel much more comfortable with younger deaf LGBT people. But also nationally across the UK, I do have, deaf LGBT friends across the country too. But because they're spread all over the country, it's difficult to meet with them on a regular basis. So I have to kind of wait until I have a holiday or I have a break so I can go and visit them, or they come and visit me. So it's quite sporadic. And I don't have very many deaf LGBT friends here in London. I'm fortunate because I think a few years ago I um, found the deaf LGBT. I found a group of people who are deaf and identify as LGBT. So actually, we have that in common, and I found people who have that similar life experience. And I was really happy to found that group of people, to found that group of friends. That's been really great for me. And yeah, and kind of going forward now, I have a group of people that I can see regularly and go out with and do normal things. Yeah, I'm also really happy that the deaf community are actually very open-minded. They're very accepting of LGBT people. And as I mentioned before, the deaf community is very, very small. It's very, very close knit. So actually, it kind of has to be open-minded. It has to be accepting of everybody in difference. And because it's so close knit, rumors spread like wildfire. Rumors spread very, very quickly. Um, and unfortunately, there are some rumors about transgender people. Somebody might come out to somebody, and then actually that's not held in confidence. That rumor spreads like wildfire, and the whole community suddenly knows about it. Or there'll be instances where people come up to you and go, "I hate you," or there's kind of some kind of conflict, and then people see that, and then rumors spread, and it's like, "Oh, did you see what happened? I heard about this," and and yeah, so unfortunately, rumors are there, but that's just very much part of the deaf way of life. But the great thing about London is you can meet, lots of people, um, going to deaf events and actually meeting new deaf people and deaf LGBT people at those events. So actually, from attending all those events, I've been able to meet uh, other people and actually kind of grab them and invite them and say, "Oh, there's a deaf LGBT event here. It'd be really nice if you came." So actually, I'm able to network and meet people through those networks. I also just want to kind of make you aware that if you are a deaf or an LGBT person and you're interested in this topic, last month I volunteered for Deaf Rainbow UK. The old name was Deaf LGBTIQA UK. But there was a lot of for deaf people having to fingerspell that. It was a very long thing. It was a very long word to fingerspell because you had to fingerspell every letter. So they changed it to Deaf Rainbow UK just to make it a bit more efficient with this to sign it. But yeah, aside from that, I was volunteering for this organisation last month, and we organised an online social for deaf LGBT plus people. And last Saturday, I organised an online kind of event, an online festival. It was actually really successful. We had about 18, but we had about 15 to 18 people attend, and yeah, it was great to meet new people, to see new faces, to see old faces, to see people that I know but haven't seen in a long time. Yeah, it was great. And we'll be planning some new events as well in 2 weeks' time, Saturday in 2 weeks' time, on the 24th of October. What day is it now? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 24th of October. We're not in November yet. So yeah, I mean, so if you're deaf um, and LGBT, then yeah, come to the event. And that's it from me. If you have any questions, please, if you can type it in the chat box. If you're in Zoom, then you can put it in the chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook live stream, then you can add some questions in the comments. Any questions? No questions so far. Maybe some of you are a bit scared or a bit shy. I'm open to questions. I'm open. Or maybe if you think I've missed a few points or anything, feel free to add. Or if you have any questions generally about the deaf community or about the LGBT community, I'm happy to answer those. In my situation, what advice would I give them? I think if they weren't sure, if they were confused, had all these emotions going on, I would say take your time. Like, don't feel pressured to come out. I think, maybe later on you still don't know. That's absolutely fine. But I think if you're still questioning, just give yourself time and you'll know who you are eventually. Yeah. And also, it's difficult, and it also depends on if your family are going to accept it, if your friends are going to accept it. So there's all those factors as well to consider. I think I'm definitely lucky because my family and friends were accepting of me. But I think for people whose families don't accept LGBT people, then that can be very, very challenging. Yeah, but I'll tell you what though, I think in the future, things will get better. Things will get better as we go forward, trust me. And this is the sign for gay, by the way. Yeah. And there's another sign, LGBT plus, lesbian, B, bisexual. That's the sign for bisexual. What's the other one? Oh, I just realized I just missed gay. Sorry. Yeah, gay. So LGBT, transsexual, trans. I don't know if you know any others. If you want to know any more signs. Yeah, somebody just said thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, you're very welcome. Got something from saying hello. What do you think the LGBTQ plus community can do to help the barriers you face? See, it's really difficult to fingerspell LGBTQ. To help the barriers you face, I would say that if you organise LGBT events, then to make sure that deaf people can actually access those. So, for example, the London Pride Festival, they always book interpreters and there's captioning there so that it's accessible for deaf people. Obviously, that was pre-COVID times. I don't know what it's going to be like in the future, but making sure that there's interpreters available on stage, that there's cameras and captioning and subtitles, so that it's inclusive and that it's accessible for deaf people. And and it's nice to see that in the Pride marches and the festivals around the country. That a few Pride festivals around the country have been really, really accessible. So I think the key thing is making sure that events are accessible. From Jody, another question. Do you think more effort needs to be made by the hearing LGBTQ community to be more inclusive of deaf people? I think it's a similar question. I think it's relating to, making things accessible and keeping that in mind, actually. I think there are some events where you could use, I don't know, maybe thinking about how could a deaf person be involved in this event? If it's an LGBT organization, then thinking about, have you booked note takers, captioners, interpreters? Do you have the budget to pay for those services? I don't know why I said note take. I'm thinking of university lectures. Put university aside. I've still got university on the brain. I'm like, note takers for a festival. I mean interpreters, sorry. So yeah, making sure that there's a budget for interpreters, making sure that you provide interpreters and subtitles as well, captioning, and making sure that you've got the funding and the budget available for that. Or, worst case scenario, seeing if any interpreters will do pro bono work. But yeah, I think it's really good idea to include the deaf community in those events. Jyoti has asked, how does your experience with making friends differ with those who are part of the deaf community and those who are not? I hope that makes sense. Well, I mean, I guess what makes me different to my friends compared to to other deaf people who are not LGBT, I guess I can compare those two experiences. And I think if you're straight and deaf and not involved in the LGBT community, then really you can meet anybody. And I don't think that straight deaf people really think about, oh, I have to make friends with LGBT people. That's not really at the front of their minds. They just kind of meet other people, anybody. Whereas if you're a deaf person that went to a deaf school and you grew up with a group of friends at a deaf school, my situation is different because I've moved around to so many different schools. So growing up, it's been difficult for me to make friends and to form those solid friendship groups. Julia has asked, how have you found delivering this talk online? I did actually deliver this face to face originally once before to a group of people, but what's the difference between face to face and Zoom? I think the main difference is if I'm making any jokes, then I can see the audience laughing, and then I'm like, okay, good, I made the joke and it worked. Whereas on Zoom, I can't see who I'm talking to. So if I'm making jokes, I'm like, did you actually laugh though? Did you actually laugh though? That's the other thing. But also, like, if I see the interpreter laugh, because I've got the interpreter on screen. So if the interpreter laughs, then it's like, okay, well, at least the interpreter laughed. But yeah, it's an interesting experience. But also, I have to make sure that the room looks good as well. If I'm going to an event, I have to, dress properly, dress nicely, dress up. On Zoom, kind of, it's an extra responsibility to make sure that my room is tidy as well. Oh, brilliant. Good. I'm happy to hear that you've enjoyed my jokes. Good. How has COVID affected the deaf LGBT community? I think my experience since the pandemic has meant, well, we've all started working remotely much more through Zoom. So events have become much more irregular, much more sporadic. I think meeting deaf friends, we're used to kind of playing games and coming all together and seeing each other regularly. And since coronavirus, I spent lockdown at my mum's house, which meant that I couldn't come to London to meet my other friends. I was stuck there. And actually the only way that I could communicate with them was through FaceTime and Zoom and through remote interactions. But actually we still had a good time. I did miss the games that we used to play and kind of just the social side of it. And then when I moved back to London, I was then able to start meeting up with my friends again, which has been good. So I think, yeah, it's a very strange situation that we're in. Do deaf attitudes to LGBT vary around the world? I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to say because my experience is based in the UK. I have met a few deaf people from around the world who have told me about their experiences. Some are positive, some say that it's open-minded, some have negative experiences, some say that the deaf community is closed-minded. A few people have told me about their negative experiences in certain countries, I think South America or China, I can't remember where exactly, but I have had some that people telling me their experiences about the deaf community not being as open-minded as they are here. But I think Instagram, as an Instagram page called deaf, and then like at the bottom is like LGBT deaf underscore LGBT underscore family underscore international or something, but it's in international signs. It's not subtitled, unfortunately. But if there's any deaf people or any sign language users who are interested in that topic, that's a good Instagram page to follow. And once a week they do a live stream. I think from the top of my head. Mona's asked. So you mentioned that the deaf community wasn't as open-minded before. Um, did you ever consider staying in the closet to avoid prejudice? Well, I never thought about that, to be honest. I wanted to find my identity first. I wanted to find out who I was first. I wanted to be confident and comfortable with who I am. And I feel fortunate that I was able to come out in kind of 20 years. I think 7 years ago I came out. So yeah, I mean, some people have, the reactions I've had so far have been mainly positive, but I mean, it would be a different story if it was somebody like me, but who grew up maybe 10, he was 10 years older, growing up 10 years ago, 10 years before me, then that would have been I imagine, much harder for them. So I'm just very lucky that my family are very open-minded anyway and very accepting. I have one gay cousin as well, so some really interesting questions. Yeah, if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them, write them up in the chat. Or if you're interested to know any kind of more information about the online social, the Deaf LGBT online social, if you're deaf yourself, or if you're deaf LGBT, if you want to know more information about that, I'm happy to give you some more information about that. Daniel, do you have any more comments? Are there any more questions in the comments on Facebook or no? Yeah, and also thank you for having me. And thank you for your time to watch me and listen to me. And yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Oh, one more question. Oh, what's this? Oh, that is a good question. Oh, I could write an essay about this. Well, the question is, how does being deaf affect your experience dating in the LGBT community? I've never actually been on a proper date with anyone, because normally it's like app dating, or meeting kind of LGBT people through friends, or people will kind of, nobody really approaches me and asks me, oh, should we go out on a date or whatever. That doesn't really happen. Um, but also, if I meet a deaf person, maybe in a deaf community group, or what would you call it, like a, well, the English word is like a, oh, I see. So the pool, basically, to put it into hearing terms, is it's a small pool. It's a small pond, basically, the deaf community, compared to the hearing LGBT community, which is a big pond. So kind of there's less selection, there's less choice within the deaf community, the deaf LGBT community. And yeah, so sometimes I will go on dates with hearing people. I prefer it if that person knows sign language or is interested in learning sign language. I just feel more comfortable using sign language. But yeah, I think yeah, just to keep it brief, that's essentially it. Are there any follow-on questions or any additional questions? I think that's it. I think we've covered everything. Perfect. No more questions, Daniel's written. Okay, great. Okay, well then in that case, then I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for watching me. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.